Okay, hi everyone. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. We've got 3 people on the panel today who I'll just mention. We've got Bianca, Jade, and Emily. So what they'll do is they'll.
You might think I'm a different Emily in that case, because I'm not on the panel.
Oh right, which Emily is on the panel?
I'm Emily Squires. I'm just.
Okay, this is where it got confused. I'm sure she'll go eventually. So for now, we've got 2 people. What happened to Emily Claire? Is Emily Claire here?
Well, yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. All this time. You know why, Emily? Because you said your username was Emily, which was the same as the other Emily, and that's why it got all mixed up. Okay, so
I was under pressure there.
sorry about that. So we've got Bianca, Emily Compton, and Jade Elliston, who's on the panel. What they'll do is they'll spend a couple minutes introducing themselves, talking a little bit about their experiences, which university they're on, and whatever else they think is useful. And then in the meantime, guys, if you guys want to pop some questions in the chat, I'll read those out, and then each member will have a go answering that as well. So sound good? Great. Okay, Bianca, since you're first on my list, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. We were talking, the 3 of us, earlier, and we thought to ask everybody who's here tonight to, if you feel comfortable, put your video on, just mainly for us to kind of talk to people and not gray squares. But if you don't, and I mean, there's only a few of us tonight, but if you don't feel comfortable, that's absolutely fine. We don't want to force you to do anything you don't want to do. But yeah, thanks Jason for organizing this. So I'm Bianca. I'm a first-year trainee on the UEL course. And as you can probably tell, I'm not from here. I actually grew up in Italy, and I moved to the UK after I finished high school, and I kind of stayed here. But I thought that would be good to mention, just if there are any other Europeans here tonight who have some questions about getting on the course when you're not from the UK. So after I finished my undergrad in psychology, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. So I went on and did a master's in clinical neuropsychology. And I actually did that in the Netherlands. And I had the opportunity to go back to the UK to do a short placement in neuropsychology. It was 3 months long with a clinical neuropsychologist. And that's really when I found out about clinical psychology and the doctorate. So I was kind of late to the party, really. And at the end of the placement, I was very lucky and I got an assistant psychologist post down in England. I was studying in Scotland originally, and that was an adult community mental health team, but mainly my job was in the memory assessment service. So I was doing neuropsychological assessments with older people who had memory problems. And that was kind of a diagnostic tool, or I was adding some information, like a missing piece of the puzzle, to see whether they had a dementia or not. And so I was in that job for a year. And then after that, I moved on to a different AP post in CAMS. So I kind of went from one side of the spectrum to the other. So from older adults to children and young people and their families. And I was in that job for a year. And during that year, I applied to the doctorate. That was actually my second time applying. And that was the year I got on to UEL. So I only had an interview with them, and luckily it turned out into a place. And yeah, that's very briefly my sort of journey to the course. I wanted to mention that it was my second time applying because I'm one of those people who wanted to apply all the time, and I think I really benefited from just writing an application form and reflecting on my experience, and really taking a long time to reflect. So even though I didn't get any interviews the first year, I still found it quite useful to kind of practice writing the form. Sometimes the question that people ask is whether it'd be worth to have a practice year, and my advice would be yes, if you're not too invested in the process. So if you think that it would be too much to kind of go through it, then don't. But I found it quite helpful. And yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I'm happy to answer more specific questions if you have any. But that's it.
Great, thank you. Emily?
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'm always a bit conscious about this on Zoom. Yeah, great, okay. So hi, I'm Emily. I'm just going into my third year at the University of Leicester. So I did my undergrad degree at Aston University, and I graduated in 2016. And I don't have a master's, because that seems to be a question that people ask quite a lot. And there's a few other people on my course as well who don't have masters. So whilst I was at uni, I did some bank shifts as a healthcare support worker, mainly on acute adult mental health wards, and that was mainly kind of in holidays to fit around my degree. And then I was fortunate to have been able to do a voluntary assistant post part-time once, pretty much as soon as I graduated, and that was in a low secure forensic unit. It was really valuable experience, and my supervisor was like very invested in kind of ensuring that I really got a lot out of the experience. And alongside that, I guess partly to earn a bit of money, but it was also very helpful and different experience. I worked as a clinical audit assistant in the NHS, and that gave me an insight into the clinical audit process, and is kind of really the only researchy type experience I have, although it's not a research assistant post by any stretch. And then after about, I think, 7 months, I was lucky enough to get an assistant post in an IAPT service, which was mainly involving doing assessments and delivering groups as well. And so then I think I'd been there for about 6 months when I first applied, and then obviously it was a bit longer by the time I actually came to interview. And Leicester was the only place that I got an interview, which was through selection tests. And yeah, that's me really. I was lucky enough to have only applied the once, which I recognise as fortunate. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about Leicester's process or the course as well, because obviously it's 2 years in now. So yeah.
And Jade?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Because I'm also conscious of Zoom.
Oh, it's a little quiet.
A little quiet. Is that better?
Say that one more thing.
No. Is that better?
Yeah, is that all right with everyone else?
Sorry.
Okay, I think it's fine.
I'll try and speak really loudly. Yeah, so I'm Jade. I'm currently a first year trainee on the Oxford course. I started my journey as an undergrad at Bath University. I was very lucky to do an integrated placement degree. So I did a year as an assistant psychologist or an honorary assistant psychologist rather, in an autism service, where I helped to run groups. I had an audit role, helped out with diagnostic assessments, and generally just sort of helped out around the service for a year. From there, I worked with MenCap, well, throughout my undergraduate degree, but mostly in my sort of the latter half. I also helped out on some PhD projects as well while I was an undergraduate. From there, when I graduated, I got a job as a learning support assistant for children with autism in sort of a referral unit, I guess, for children who had been expelled quite a few times from school, and they're at risk of going to a residential school far away from home, so we were sort of like a last chance saloon really to try and integrate them into mainstream education by putting in lots of strategies to support them behaviourally, certainly. And from there, I stayed there for about 6 months, and then I went to a psychiatric hospital as a support worker on a developmental programme for about a year, where they, alongside all the support work duties, they trained us to do risk assessments and admission and discharge procedures. We got involved in the audit of the Mental Health Act and had lots of really high quality training in different aspects of the mental health system, which was really useful and valuable. And after about a year or so, the assistant psychologist post came up on my ward, and I got that post shortly afterwards. I stayed there for about 2.5 years, which is a long time. But alongside that assistant post, I did my master's degree part-time as well, as my supervisor advised that I do that. However, I would say as a caveat to that even though I had the master's on my application, I have since been told that it didn't count in my application because it wasn't finished. So I also technically didn't have a master's when I applied. And as I was in my second year of my master's and in the last year of my role as an assistant, I applied to the doctorate and I got an interview at Oxford. I was reserve listed for an interview at Royal Holloway. And yeah, that was it. But I didn't get called for interview for Royal Holloway. I was quite far down the list. But I was lucky enough to get a place at Oxford. So that's where I am now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I can see no one's put in any questions yet. I'm assuming everyone was just really engaged with what the panelists had to say. So I'll maybe start us off then. Assuming, we've got a question. All right, I'll let Hayley go first. So do masters not count if you're not finished when applying? So who has the information on that?
I guess I've since been told that specifically for Oxford, just because when they asked for all my certificates and things, when I got my offer, I asked if they wanted something about my master's, and they said that it's not that it didn't count as such. I think what I meant by it didn't count was that Oxford have an academic sort of, not so filter, but they have like an academic shortlisting process. And if you have a master's degree, it counts for some points. So I don't think mine counted in that shortlisting system. I don't know for certain, but that's the impression that I got from the emails that I had in response to my question about like anything to do with my master's. It just sort of said, no, we don't require anything because we didn't count it in the shortlisting.
Great, thank you. Emily, Bianca, you got any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's hard to give an answer for every uni because every uni has its own way of dealing with it. I mean, I think for some universities, having a master's doesn't add any points to your application as long as you have the required degree classification from your undergrad. So if you're wondering about it and you know what universities you're applying to, then it's probably best to ask them directly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I've heard similar things, that it doesn't necessarily count, but then it could count in other ways because you've probably still learned really valuable skills in the time that you have spent on it. So yeah, I think you'd have to find out with maybe the individual courses, as I'm sure they probably have different opinions on it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so we've got a question asking, did you have any publications when applying? Bianca?
No, not really. I did present my undergrad dissertation at the BPS undergraduate conference. So that's dissemination. So I didn't have any real publications. I just really milked everything I did. So I put that on the form, and then I like created a leaflet with some service users, and that was disseminated in the local area that I worked with. So I put that. And then, yeah, I presented like the results of an audit to some people in the trust, but I didn't have any like official academic publications. I just got really creative with what I had and maximized, like really marketed it out a lot.
Right. Emily?
Yeah, I certainly didn't have any publications. Or really, like I said, I did work in clinical audit for a few months, but other than that, my only real experience was my undergraduate dissertation. But I guess similar to Bianca, I did, you know, like I had presented the results of the audit to a few different kind of groups within the trust, and it had been kind of incorporated into quite like significant reports in the trust. So I wrote about that because it still counted as dissemination. And similarly, I was just trying to make use of what I did have, because I didn't have any official publications by any stretch. No.
Great. And Jade?
I didn't have any publications either. Similar to Bianca, I presented my undergraduate dissertation at the BPS undergraduate conference, which I think you can technically state as a conference publication, and I did state that on my application. But again, I definitely agree with Bianca in that I just milked everything I had done for all it's worth. Any sort of dissemination that you've done, like if you've presented findings from a literature review, if you've contributed to a publication that you know has been published, you can say that. If you've presented a project to a service or anything like that, yeah, I obviously outline what it is that you've done and say what it is. You obviously don't stretch it beyond the truth, but you know, state what you have. I wouldn't say discount anything that I would say discount your experience, even if it's not like published. That's what I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that really ties to that question about dissemination, because I think we see quite often on the group people asking, oh, what do you do if you don't have research experience? And that's not really what the question's asking. Anything around information sharing would count of any kind, and that's something a lot of people probably will have to some capacity. So we've got,
I think as well.
Oh, done.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking as the others were talking. Something. So I had to do it in my first year. Was a service evaluation, and the service that I was in at the time were so keen, and they had so many ideas about things that they wanted evaluated. And I think that's something that you could potentially get involved in, whether you're an AP or in another position within a service, because there are always things that can be evaluated, and it's very clinically relevant often as well. So if you're wanting more things to put in there, I would sort of maybe ask if there's any opportunities for service evaluations that you could do, whether you've got ideas or whether the service has ideas, because it is really good to kind of build your skills with kind of a clinically relevant project. So that's something maybe you could ask about, and it's something I would recommend after doing one myself.
Yeah, and echoing that, it's something I think a lot of clinical leads or managers would be quite happy to hear. I offered it once in my service for just to check the workshop recovery rates, and that was something they were really eager to support. So it is definitely worth asking. Got a question of, if you know where your first choice for the doctorate is, would you recommend tailoring the application to them and risk alienating other courses, or being a bit more generic? Bianca?
I mean, it's a gamble. I don't think we can really give a proper answer, because at the end of the day, it's probably your decision. I guess in my experience, out of the 4 unis that I applied to, I had like top 2 preferences. And my application, I guess you could say that it was probably tailored to those 2 and probably more so to UEL, but it wasn't something I did consciously. I think it just kind of came out in just writing it, and I think it just so happened that I guess my values matched the uni that I ended up at. But I guess I would be cautious about that, because there isn't really a recipe for the perfect application form, and what you might think is tailoring it to them, they might not see it as such. So as cheesy as it sounds, I would just kind of, be yourself really. And if they like that, then they'll offer you an interview, and that's probably the best place for you to go to, rather than trying to fit a mold of what you think they might want, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same as what you said, Bianca. I think, as cliche as it sounds, if your values match the course that you want to go to, which hopefully they will, which is hopefully why that's your kind of first choice, I think if you really do just be your authentic self in the application, that will show through. And I think the more you try to appear as their kind of ideal candidate, probably the more you'll move away from actually being yourself, and therefore showing kind of your values in the application. If I don't know if that makes sense, but what Bianca said, basically, I agree with.
And Jade? Oh, can't hear anything.
Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Sorry. This is awful. Yeah, I think definitely echoing Bianca and Emily. I mean, I would say I agree with what Bianca said about, I guess, I mean, I had two top choices, and I guess looking back, maybe my application was sort of tailored toward them, but again, I didn't do that consciously. Yeah, I guess I agree with the other two that the best thing to do is to sort of reflect on your experiences as you would for any application, and to avoid sort of trying to, as Bianca said, to avoid fitting yourself to a mold, because I mean, for one, it may not come across in the way that you think it does, but equally you might try and fit yourself to a mold that, if you were to get there, that you may not like either. So yeah, I guess, yeah, be yourself, and hopefully you'll be happy where you get to in that.
Isn't Msc Conversion as valuable as a Bsc/Msc? I've just finished a BPS accredited Msc Conversion, which gave me a GBC for BPS. Yeah, I don't know if this will take everyone, if you want to just answer in one word. Bianca?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, is an Msc Conversion as valuable as a B? Yeah, definitely. I think it's maybe in a way more valuable because it shows that you can, I mean, I've never done the conversion course, but from what I've heard, it's just a very intense year where they try to fit everything that your undergrad was meant to do. So I think it's probably harder than a 3 or 4 year psychology course. But yeah, I don't really think that they would see it as less valuable. I think at the end of the day, as long as you have the grade that they want, so be it a 2-1 or a high 2-1 or whatever it is, then that's fine, I think.
Yeah, I don't think you'd be penalised for having the conversion over an undergraduate, but I would say if you're unsure, the clearinghouse would probably have the information for each unit. I don't know if Emily or Jade has anything they want to add that's not been mentioned.
I really don't think that you'd be penalised. I think ultimately all they're looking for, not all that they're looking for, in terms of that side of things, they want the BPS accredited qualification, and whether that's a conversion course or an undergraduate degree, I think it is kind of like a tick box in that sense that you've actually got that, or that's always been my understanding anyway. And I think there's at least one person in my cohort that has done that, has gone down that route.
I've not heard of anybody being penalised for having a conversion degree. I think, as Emily said, that as long as it's, my understanding as well is that it needs to be BPS accredited. But again, I think anything to do with qualifications or degrees or anything like that, just check out with the individual courses if you're unsure.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I think we've got quite a nice question here. What do you think made you stand out in your application? So you've got to big yourself up a bit. Bianca?
That's a difficult question. I don't know. I think what I tried to do is to put a lot of my values to try and stand out, because I think we probably all have similar-ish experiences in terms of like work experience. And I thought, well, probably what makes me unique is the way, yeah, the kind of clinician I want to become, and my values. But I did, in the very last box, when it asks about like any other information, I did talk very briefly about my background and having been raised in a bilingual and bicultural environment and now living in a third country, and how that impacted me professionally. I don't know if that's, if they read that and are like, aha, we found the candidate. But that definitely made me feel like I was giving something unique about myself. And obviously I made sure that I related it back to why would make me a better candidate for training. So I wasn't just telling them about myself. I also kind of explained how it influences me as a clinician. So yeah, I think that's probably what helped me.
Right. Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I'm still not sure to this day. I think similar to Bianca, I guess I just went with the approach that there's so many people that apply and it is incredibly competitive, and anything that I say I've done in terms of like, I don't know, like developing my ability to do a risk assessment or deliver groups, whatever it may be, I thought like how many other people will also have that on their application, and that's not because it's not good, but it's I guess a lot of the stuff I'd done was what they would expect someone applying to have done. So I really just tried to focus on my values and maybe what I could bring as a person, and also, as everyone says, kind of reflect and think about what I'd actually taken from the experiences I had and what I had learned, and how those experiences and those reflections would make me a good candidate for training. And also I think to like take time on I think it's very easy to focus on like the main question, the first question, I think, or but the main one about what makes you a good candidate, but actually the other questions, like the one about what you do outside of training, I think is also really important. And I think that one is a question that probably people could glaze over or rush or think isn't as valuable, but I think it is, because it still tells them a lot about you as a person and about your values and about you outside of the course, which is also going to impact you as a psychologist and as a clinician. But yeah, I have no idea what made me get an interview.
Selling herself a bit short there, but and I think touching on that last question, I think that's a really good one to it was discussed briefly yesterday, not yesterday, the day before, on just that section being the one that really shows that you are human and that you have interests outside of psychology, because it's a very stressful course, so they want to be able to see that you can manage it as well. And Jade?
I think I would echo Emily in that I also don't really have any idea of what specifically made me stand out. I think if I was to hypothesize, maybe just picking up on what you were saying, Jason, about like the human element of the application, something that I have noticed from successful applications and what I tried to put into mine, having read some successful applications, was I guess trying to get across the idea of there being a real person behind a lot of what was being written, because I think that obviously a lot of people applying will have very similar experiences, and as Emily and Bianca pointed out, it's sort of about how you think about how they've affected you as a practitioner, but maybe also personally and in your other professional capacities as well. And yeah, the question about what you do outside, I think, really goes a long way to show that there's a human behind the application. So I think I talked about that I liked watching the Bake Off and trying my best to replicate some of the challenges and failing miserably. And yeah, I also talked about my own experiences of mental health through my family. I didn't talk about that in the main part. I talked about that in the extra bit at the end where it says, is there anything else that you think is relevant? And I sort of reflected on my experiences of my of mental health issues in my family and how that has shaped my practice and how I come to understand, or one way in which I can understand mental health problems. So I guess in that I was quite hesitant about putting that in, and I think anybody with that kind of experience, either vicariously through family or their own lived experience, it can feel quite exposing, and it can feel very difficult, and it's definitely a personal decision to do that. I think I had a lot of help shaping that section from my supervisor, and I had to be very comfortable with what I would write in, obviously because I could be asked about it in an interview, and obviously you have to be happy with somebody reading that sort of thing. But I think it helped. I think the way that I was happy with the way that I put it in the end, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of summarising everyone's answers, and this is something that's been kind of a theme across the other webinars as well, is that the applications are really personal and very reflective, and it isn't so much a kind of, oh, I did this, I did that, I ticked this box. It is more kind of presenting yourself and your journey on what you've learned and why that makes you ready for the training as well. And I think many people, myself included, when we did our first applications, we kind of all made that mistake of trying to say, well, this is why, this is what I've done, which many people would have as well. So we've got a question from Georgina. So I think this one's aimed more at Emily. So similar to Kerry's question, but specific to Leicester, do you have any tips for Leicester specifically in terms of the application process at all?
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Do you mean in terms of the application itself, or the sort of selection interview process? I don't know which you're referring to.
Selection process, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure you know that I think it's actually changed slightly since the year that I applied. So I think when I applied, if you met the minimum requirements, then I think you should have been invited to the selection test. Whereas I think now there is kind of more of a scoring of your application as well, and then however many people from there go to the computer test. So I guess there's more emphasis on your application than there was when I applied. In terms of the tests themselves, I'm sure everyone who's done them would agree they're quite difficult to prepare for. But there are some practice tests that you can do online, which I did, but I guess I didn't spend too much time on them, because I knew that there was little I could do to prepare, basically. Unfortunately, if there was more I could have done to prepare, I would have done. And if it was like a research test, then maybe I could have, but because it's kind of like verbal reasoning and non-verbal reasoning, that kind of thing, it's really hard to prepare. I think Leicester are, like, the message I've had since being on the course, the message that I had at the interview, like all throughout really, has been like very much that they are interested in you as a person, and like right from the start of the interview day, we were spoken to by the kind of head of selection, who was like, look, you're here because you're good enough. We just want to get to know you, and we just want to know if you're going to be a good fit for the course. So I think if you, as we've kind of already said, if you can really just try and be yourself right from when you kind of do your application and anything that follows that, I think that will serve you really well, because I don't know, I'm rambling, I guess, but one thing I always try and like think about, and tried to think about when I was applying, is that they're not expecting you to be a qualified psychologist. They're not expecting you to know everything, because that's why you're going to get onto training. They just want to know that you understand what the kind of job involves, and that your values kind of fit with the values that a psychologist should have. So I think if you can sort of demonstrate your values and in your application, or if you do get an interview, kind of in the interview, that is going to serve you much better than being like, well, I've done this and I know this model and this is why, you know, I should get on, because actually they're going to teach you all of that. And you could know nothing about CBT, and that's okay, because you're going to be taught it, you know, very soon after you get on the course. So I think just, yeah, basically just focus on your values and why they fit with the course. And I think that that's kind of the best advice I can give, really. If you have any more specific questions, just 'cause I'm not sure exactly what part you're referring to, then just let me know and I'll try and answer them.
Oh, forgot to unmute myself. So I've got a question now on diversity. How diverse is your current cohort in terms of gender and ethnicity? Bianca, I mean, do you know yet? Have you just...
Yeah, I mean, we started a couple of weeks ago, but it's all been online. But I'd say that it's not, I mean, clinical psychology is not a very diverse profession, as we all are aware of, I think. It does reflect the same kind of population that you see in people who have a psychology degree. So it is mainly women. We have, I think there's 39 of us this year, and I think there's like 4 guys, or maybe 5. And same in terms of ethnicity, I think it's quite white dominated. There is some diversity, but I can't really tell you a specific figure because I don't really know off the top of my head. But I guess in general it reflects what you tend to see in psychology graduates in general.
Yeah, and I know UEL in particular, were, when I attended their open day a few years ago, they mentioned they were quite keen on increasing that and having more of a diverse cohort. But it seems to be quite a struggle, doesn't it, for across all the universities?
Yeah.
Particularly, there's something perhaps in the selection process. I know each year the universities try and change it up a bit, but unfortunately the selection process can never be completely fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's definitely something that they are trying to address. And I think there's talks about doing a contextual selection process at UEL and maybe other unis, but I don't think it's official yet, but I think it would entail kind of, after you submit your application, to send more information if you think it would be relevant to essentially your chance of getting onto the course. But I don't really know much about it.
sounds good. Let's fingers crossed they'll keep progressing each year on that. Emily?
So my cohort is a lot smaller. There's I think there was 12 of us, and then we've had kind of people join and leave due to maternity leave, and I think now there's 11 of us. And in terms of gender, I think there's quite, so we have 4 men out of 11, which is a pretty good split when you look at kind of the proportion of men that apply compared to women. But yeah, obviously still more females. But in terms of diversity or ethnic diversity, I think again it kind of reflects undergraduate psychology degrees, and I guess some of the kind of issues with the profession more widely. I think we have at the moment one person from a BAME background, I think off the top of my head. Yeah, and I think that's fairly similar in the cohort below me. I've not actually met the new intake, but certainly the year below me.
Thank you. And Jade?
I think, I mean, I'm not sure totally in terms of what, in terms of like gender identity and things like that. But certainly from what I've seen on Zoom, I mean, we're on Zoom as well. So I haven't met anybody in person, and we haven't really talked amongst ourselves that much. It does seem to be a little more diverse than certainly that I expected, just from knowing that the profession is dominated by white middle class women. So that was quite refreshing. I know Oxford have been trying to diversify their selection process. I think they have been putting on some events specifically for applicants from a BAME background. I've just tried to have a Google and see when it's due to be this year. And I think it's on their website as the 10th of October 2020. It's called Me, Myself and Intersectionality, an event for aspiring BAME psychologists. So I think they're trying to sort of widen participation a lot. Obviously there's always more that can be done, and it's definitely a problem that is being noted. So yeah, in terms of age, I noticed there's an age question.
Yep. So yeah, we're going to continue on that.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mention, I mean, as I said, I think there's 4 or 5 guys that I can see on the Zoom calls, and I think there's 32 of us. I think there's more men than there has been in previous years, but it's still very dominated by women. And age, I think, I mean, I don't know if I'm honest in terms of age, because I think I look about 15 at times and I'm 26. So, I mean, people can look older or younger. So I don't know in terms of age. I know there are some people have alluded to having had a lot of experience prior or had a research career prior, which would suggest that maybe they're slightly older. I know that my buddy in the year above, she had a whole career and then another career before she came to clinical psychology. So she's quite a lot older as well. But in terms of age, I really don't know. In terms of the diversity, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Emily, in terms of age?
In terms of age, I'm just trying to think as well, because obviously I've known my cohort for a couple of years, but I still don't want to like cause offence accidentally. I think so I think when we started, so I'm the youngest in my cohort, so I was quite young. I was 23, and I think the oldest is or was late 30s at the time, and there's a real mix. I'd say maybe the kind of majority are around like late 20s to early 30s.
Thank you. And Bianca, if you know yet.
Yeah, I think, I mean, similar to what Jade said, it's hard to tell online how old someone is. There's a bit of a mix. There are a few people who are career changers as well. I think someone said that they're in their early 50s. So that's probably the oldest in our year. But there are a few who have care responsibilities. I know that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're older or younger, but oh, it's actually unstable.
Well,
You
no, we
hear
can
me?
still hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so I think definitely more of a mix than what I'm used to. But yeah.
If you want to save on bandwidth, you can maybe turn your camera off if it struggles. It might make it a bit better. But okay. And then we've got a question about, can you just write the bullet points in the publication dissemination section, add link to online sources rather than write long paragraphs? Bianca, going back to you again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know what people prefer in terms of like the short list, or I imagine when I was writing my application, I was trying to kind of make it easier for the reader to read through it and understand it. And so I think that's definitely a paragraph that lends itself well to bullet points. I don't know about links, because I don't think they can really click on a link when they look at your form. So I'm not sure, but it's up to you. And I guess if you have a lot of publications, then you're probably going to have more of a list of things and less detail.
I do want to add one of the course tutors at Royal Holloway did once say that if that's fine to do, and if you can't access the link, he will find the publication and check that your name is on it as well. And he mentioned that's because he wants to make sure no one's lying, because apparently that has happened. So, but that's Royal Holloway, and it's very hard to say with other universities. But Emily, you might have a different view.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I just had a look at my application, and as we said earlier, I mean, I don't have publications, so I've only got a couple of paragraphs, but they're quite big paragraphs, and it says how many characters there are left, and I think there's a 1500 character limit, and I had almost 500 left, and that was just two quite lengthy paragraphs. So I guess it depends. If it's about saving space, then you may have to, and I think it's more important that you include what you've done than miss things out. You know, if you can save space and bullet point and it means you can get everything in, then I definitely do it. But I think my approach with the application in general was to not bullet point, but that's not to say that it's wrong to do it, but I just took the approach that I'd rather write kind of full paragraphs and sentences personally. But I don't know, I've never been told.
And it's very hard because it's very subjective, the whole process, in that, you know, it really depends on the people who review your application, and everyone's got a preference for what they like. So some things like that can be very tricky to give a very clear-cut answer on. Jade, what's your thoughts?
I think my section was definitely a lot more bitty than the rest. So, I mean, I put my sort of stab at a publication at the top, my conference publication, and then other than that, I just had, I think, a couple of sentences for each thing that I was describing as dissemination. I didn't really write any reflective parts at that point. I think that's important to mention. I don't know if that had an effect or not, but I just sort of wrote, whilst as an assistant psychologist in X service, I completed this audit, which I then disseminated via this method to this service. If I did a project, I stated who it was with, even if it wasn't published. If it was with a psychologist, I put Dr. blah, blah, blah. But that was it. I just tried to put as much detail in as possible to try and, I think, as Bianca was saying, sort of dress it up as much as possible.
Right. Got a question here. Do people mention their own personal experience with their own family mental health barriers they have overcome, and how they can relate that to service users, etc.? Let's see, Bianca.
I think people do. I think Jade kind of mentioned this earlier, but it's really down to what you feel comfortable sharing. And I guess, you know, I think it's always important to reflect on your experiences. So I wouldn't just say that X happened to me, or I witnessed X, but I would always try to reflect on it and bring it back to the application. So why does it make me a better potential clinical psychologist? But you know, it's completely up to you. And if you do want to share it and then you're not shortlisted because of that, then that's probably not a nice course to go to. I think there's a lot of stigma around like mental health practitioners and their own mental health. So I think if you feel comfortable sharing it, then I would definitely go for it.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, as Bianca said, I guess it all has to go back to the question that's being asked. And if your own experiences or your experiences of someone that you know, you feel have kind of shaped you into, or not, you know, they've influenced you in a way that would make you a good candidate, or that they would, you know, that they're adding to why you would be a good candidate, then I think absolutely. And like Bianca said, in a kind of reflective way, rather than just saying, oh, you know, by the way, this is what I've experienced, or this is what someone else has experienced. It's kind of, this is what's happened, and this is what I've learned from that, and this is how it means I can relate better to service users, I think. Then absolutely. So it's not just about the professional or kind of experiences you've had at work or clinically.
Great. And Jade?
I think definitely echoing both Bianca and Emily. And based on my own experience of sharing my experience, it's definitely important to think about it in terms of what you're trying to say, in terms of what you've learned from it, or how it's shaped you, how it's affected you in such a way as to benefit your practice. That was definitely the advice I was given by my supervisor when I was writing my application, to sort of bring it back to how has it been useful. And ultimately, again, it's a very personal decision. You don't have to share it. If you want to, then go for it. Yeah, so is that okay? Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question here, and I'm not sure if I fully understand it, so please do step in if I haven't. But as a counsellor, is it better to emphasise the differences or similarities in my values, or both?
What do you mean?
If you want to just either speak out or pop it in the chat. While they might do that, we'll go on to the next question, and this is a question directed at Jade. Oh no, you've already given the link. Thanks for that. So I guess I'll kind of ask a question there while other people might be thinking still. Obviously the application process is quite stressful. It's a very long process, you know, starting from now all the way up until March and so on. What are some of the tips in terms of kind of managing that would work for you personally, beyond, oh, just go kind of do other things that you enjoy? Bianca?
I definitely tried to not think about it until February. So that's kind of when you start to expect unis to get back to you in terms of, or is it March? I think maybe March. So I kind of just, you know, told myself, you're not allowed to go onto the clearinghouse website until March, because no one's gonna email you, nothing is gonna happen, just ignore it. And then, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to deal with the uncertainty, and also if you start to get rejections, it's kind of hard to deal with that. But I think in general, try not to make this your identity. At the end of it's just a job. It really is. And you're not, it's not an indication of your self-worth or your intelligence or who you are as a person. So I guess try to detach, try to just see it as something external and as a job, and don't let it define who you are and what you can be. So for me, it was, I think the waiting game was okay. I was just a bit, nervous, but I don't feel like it really took over my life. But so UEL was the only uni that I interviewed at, and it was the last university to let me know about the outcome. So when they offered me the interview, I'd received that week or that month. And that was really hard because it's not nice to receive rejections. But this kind of just works for who I am as a person. I was a bit practical about it and just thought, okay, if this doesn't work out, what's my future plan? So I started thinking about career alternatives, and maybe I was being a bit dramatic because it was only like my second time applying. But I thought, okay, so I want to reapply next year. But then I really started thinking of what else I could do career-wise, and starting to like research those options. And funnily enough, while I was Googling other careers, and I got the invitation to interview, so that was nice. But yeah, I guess really my main advice is it's just a job. See it as just a job, and don't make it become part of who you are, because it's not helpful in my opinion.
Yeah, and before we kind of move on, there's a question that I thought works as a good add-on, Louise just added, which is yay or nay to following the forums in terms of your own well-being. What are your thoughts, Bianca?
I mean, I would lie. I'd say nay, but I definitely don't practice what I preach. I was on the forum a lot. So I guess you know yourself best. I'm just a very nosy person, so I really like to see what other people are up to and what they share. But if it gets too much, then try and step away. I deleted like my Facebook app in that time because it was getting a bit much. Because when someone posts like, oh, this uni sent out their emails, and then you didn't receive the email, and then you're just dying for that whole day because you didn't receive it. So maybe try to get some distance from it, but I guess it depends on how it makes you feel.
Emily, so the two questions, kind of well-being and yay or nay to the forums. And you're muted.
Thank you for not letting me continue. So the first question, it's funny that because I was actually thinking about this earlier, and I wrote it down to remind myself, and it's really similar to what you've already said, Bianca, like just not letting the doctorate become the be all and end all. And I know that is easier said than done. And I recognize obviously that I was fortunate that I got on the first time I applied, because I think my mindset was very much like, oh, well, I'm not really expecting to get anywhere, but I've got nothing to lose, and it'd be good to learn about the experience. So I'll give it a go. And that sounds silly, but obviously I still put a lot of effort into each step. And on the interview day, of course, I wasn't going in with that attitude that I didn't mind the outcome, but it just meant that it wasn't the be all and end all for me. And I was very much like, I kept saying like, this is just a job, and it's very easy to forget that with this career path because it can become all consuming. But at the time, we were like buying our first house, and you know, I had other things that were also really important to me. And even like the day before my interview, unfortunately, my grandmother was really unwell, and she didn't live nearby. So I had to, well, I chose to go and spend the day with her instead of like really sort of swatting for the interview. And actually, I think that was really helpful, because it was, I spent time with like people that mattered to me, rather than kind of getting overwhelmed with trying to revise loads of things that would come out really awkwardly anyway, because it'd be so obvious that I've just tried to learn them for the interview. But yeah, I'm going off on a tangent, but basically, yeah, just try. In any other field, it would be a lot easier to, I think, to remember that it is just a job. But I think because the process is so hard in clinical psychology, or it can be so hard, it becomes a lot easier for it to be all consuming. But actually, it is a job, and there are lots of other parts of your life that are also very important and that also matter. And then the other bit, so I don't know, I just, again, I've looked at them and it's not helped me, you know, the forums and the groups, and obviously I'm an admin for
don't discourage members to leave.
So I think it does lots of good, but having said that, I mean, I remember looking at the forum, the CLIN Sci forum, and there was a thread. I've not looked at it for a long time, but there was a thread where people would post how many times they'd applied and what the outcomes were, and it was just soul destroying. I remember reading it and thinking, why am I going to put myself through this? What's the point? Because people just seem so miserable. And I think it's important to remember that sometimes the people, and it is a really difficult, process. I'm not denying that at all. But sometimes I guess you only hear about the people who have found it really difficult and are feeling very kind of frustrated with the process, which is understandable. But quite a few people on my course did get on quite, you know, not necessarily young, but they hadn't had to apply lots and lots of times. And that's not to say that it's a problem if you do, but I think you can kind of get swept up in it. And I remember, I think it was this year or last year, there was like lots of posts and things about Leicester, because some people had received letters and some people hadn't, and people had come up with all these theories about what it meant to have received a letter or to not have received a letter. And I remember being at uni and the admin team kind of frantically running around, because there was a postal problem where the postman at the uni had only collected so many letters, and the rest of them had been like lying in a pigeonhole somewhere over the weekend, and that is literally all that it meant. And people had been like weighing envelopes to see if that meant that there was like more pieces of paper in there, and it was, you know, sometimes I think it can, you know, that at that point it wasn't helpful for people to be reading these posts, because people thought that if they hadn't heard, it meant they hadn't got on, or that they had got on and that they were waiting to send those ones out on Monday, and it was just a nightmare. So I think it depends on when it is and why you're using it. If you're using it for advice or you've got like questions, then it's really helpful. But if you're using it to track whether other people have heard, it's probably not going to be helpful.
Was that the last intake?
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah, I think I remember that. On the pages.
Yeah.
Okay, so same question, well-being and forums.
It's so much easier said than done, but trying your best not to sort of make the doctorate the centre of your existence. And it's so hard not to do, and I'm definitely guilty of doing it myself. But again, I think, echoing what Emily said, it's such a difficult process, and it feels like it takes over so many areas of your life that it sort of almost becomes such a prominent part of your life and such a prominent part of your identity that it's so hard not to think about it all the time. I think an advice that an assistant told me when I did my undergraduate placement, it didn't really mean anything to me at the time, and I don't think it did for a few years, but she said not to put your life on hold for the doctorate. She said, like, if you want to buy a house, go and buy a house. Don't think, oh, I need to move for the doctorate, oh, I can't have children, or I can't you know, I can't go dating because I might have to move, or I can't go on holiday because I need to save so I can go on this training, things like that. Try not to, as best you can, because it's so hard, try not to plan your life according to the doctoral process. I think one thing that I did that I think really helped, certainly when I got my rejections, was I wrote a letter. It might sound really cheesy. I wrote a letter to myself in, I think, September, October time, when I felt like I had a clear head, because I just foresaw that it was going to overtake my mind, having experienced it vicariously through friends. And I wrote a letter to myself, basically telling myself that it wasn't the end of the world if I didn't get any interviews, or if I got an interview and I didn't get in. And when I got my Oxford interview last, the first two responses I got were rejections, one after the other. So I think Tuesday I got my Surrey rejection or my King's rejection, and then the other, that is basically one day after the other, and I was beside myself. I think I sat at work and I didn't see a patient all day, because I just sat like looking at my email, and I was on the edge of tears like all day. And then I read my letter, and it didn't really help at the time, but it sort of helped me shift my mindset, I think, over a period of a few weeks. But I think when it starts to get to sort of March time, which is when you hear back about interviews, or if you go for selection tests, that's when I think it starts to take over. And I didn't think, even though I sort of foresaw, because I know that I probably I knew that I'd get wrapped up in it, but I didn't think it would affect me as much as it really did. And I found myself just scrolling on the Facebook group, and I don't do that normally. I found myself looking at the forum, even though I'd been told not to go on the forum, and looking at that page where it tells you sort of like, they put colours, I think, like if you've got an interview, if you've got rejected, things like that. And I found myself on that page and scrolling, and I just thought, you know, and even though I knew that it wasn't good for me, I just couldn't help it, because it's the process. So I think if you can think of anything now to put in place later on, that might be helpful, because now you may be a bit clearer in your mindset before it starts to take over. If that's helpful, that's something that I found most helpful. And with the forum, there are some parts of the forum that are very, very soul destroying, I guess. Just constant posts about, I've been applying for X amount of years and haven't got anywhere, and it is horrible, and it's horrible to read, and you think, oh gosh, like, what is the point? As Emily said, what's the point in me even having a go? It's just totally like, it's unattainable. But I think a good metaphor that I think I heard from someone in one of my roles is that it's like if you go on TripAdvisor or those review websites, most of them are bad reviews. So if you have a bad experience at a restaurant, I think you're more I don't know, maybe there's some research there, but I think you're more likely to go and write a bad review than a good one. So I think there's probably much more incidences, certainly online, of people sort of telling their stories and it's not a good experience, than because I mean, I haven't written on the forum, for example, that I got onto the doctorate, and I didn't see many people that did, and obviously several hundred people do. So I think
people have passed out from shock.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's, I think I agree with what Emily said, like it depends what you're there for. Like, some of the posts, I guess, are helpful because they list sort of questions from interviews, which, you know, can be helpful in prep. But yeah,
I would say with the forums, I think there's definitely useful information, and I don't think there's any point in completely trying to ignore it, because it's kind of like Facebook, Twitter, your fridge. It's just something you kind of automatically go to during that period. But I would try and limit how much you go. So maybe if you kind of sound good, only go on it once a day, and kind of limit yourself for 5 minutes with it. And from my observations, a lot of the people that have kind of gotten on the calls tend to come back and say, now felt like the right time to get on. It was the year where I actually was more at peace with the fact that I was never getting on. as well, and that's just kind of something to remember, that yeah, it isn't it's not an observation on your skills or competencies. It is just the case that there are so many amazing candidates out there, but the funding is just so limited as well. And so I try not to take that as a reflection of you not being able to do the doctorate as well. Going on, and there's two questions which I think again can be paired together just because they are kind of leading on one another. So the first question is, if you feel discouraged to apply after a few rejections and other pressures, would you still apply or miss a year? And then the second part is, to those who have applied multiple times, did you change your choice of university each time, or even just changed a few from the previous application? Bianca, do you want to answer those two first?
Yeah. So I applied twice, and the first time I didn't get any interviews, and then I applied the following year, but I wouldn't say I felt ready. I still don't feel ready, but I definitely felt like I'd learned a lot in that year, and I really wanted to show, I really thought that I could improve my application. And I think if you're in that position or in that moment in your life where there is a lot going on, and so it's, it's okay to take a year out. I think there's a lot of pressure to get on and to get on in a timely manner, that if you don't apply in 1 year, then you've wasted that year. And I don't think that's true. You should prioritize your own well-being. And if for that year you just want to focus on maybe, your new role or your current role, or maybe you have something else happening in your life that you want to focus on, that's okay. You shouldn't, if it feels that it's just too much pressure, and it is a lot of pressure, then take that year out. I met a girl who got onto the UCL course this year, and the year that she got on, so last year, she was actually traveling before COVID, and she took that year out to just go and travel. And I thought that was, great, and felt a bit jealous, like, oh, I'm tied.
I know who that is. I think we have a mutual friend.
So, and I guess it's been mentioned before, but don't put your life on hold for the doctorate. If there's something else you want to pursue, go ahead and do it and put it on hold. And to answer the other question, I changed my choice of universities mainly because the first year I only had a few months of work experience. So I had a very limited possibilities of like what universities I could apply to. So the following year, I could apply to, I think, all of them at that point, or most of them. So I felt like I could actually put the choices that I wanted. So that's why I changed. And yeah, so I changed most of them, really.
Great, thank you. Emily, did you apply more than once?
No. No, so I can't.
So kind of maybe put yourself in those shoes. Or anything you want to add?
I think I think it would come down to the reasons why you're applying to where you're applying. So if you're applying to courses based on their values, and that they match your values, then I think it would make sense that you applied to them or other courses with the same values. But I guess if you have the kind of benefit of hindsight, and maybe, I don't know, you've had an experience at that university, that you've gone through a selection test, or you've had feedback from them and that has changed your views, then perhaps their values don't actually fit with yours. But I would say that, I know people that applied to the same courses 1 year and then the same courses the other year and got on that year. So it's not that if you don't get accepted at university that you won't at all. And I think in terms of whether, if you were discouraged, whether you would kind of miss a year or not. I think that just would really depend on where you're at, and if it felt like and if you were to apply and not be successful, that would be kind of really damaging, or that you would really struggle with that, or that, you know, you were at a point where, yeah, that rejection would be really hard to kind of cope with. I think you have to prioritize your well-being. It's, you know, ironic that we sometimes struggle to do that within the profession, but if you think that actually, you know, what's another year, I may as well give it a go, I'm going to be okay, and I think I can cope regardless of the outcome, then I'd say you've got nothing to lose. But also, if, you know, just remembering that in that year, even if you don't apply, you're still learning, you're still building on your kind of skills and your person, and that's going to ultimately kind of help you as you do progress in your journey.
Thank you.
So it's not a wasted year, I guess, is one.
Thank you, Jade.
I mean, fortunately, I have applied only once, so I don't know about.
Unfortunately.
I mean, yeah, I guess those who I know who have applied multiple times, it's a bit of a mixture in terms of if they've changed their universities, if they've changed a couple, if they've kept the same universities. Because I guess your application is, if your application is looked at in a lot of detail, it's sort of, I don't want to use the word judged, but, you know, you're every year a different amount of people apply to university, or, you know, different kinds of people might apply with different experiences. So one year you might get an interview, another year you may not. One of my close friends who got on this year, last year got an interview at UCL, and this year did not. Another friend as well got an interview at UCL last year but didn't this year. So not that there's anything wrong with UCL at all. But I just mean that there might be different reasons why you might be selected for interview one year and not the other year, or not one year and then the other year. I guess it depends on the year, the number of people who are applying, who's selecting as well, what the shortlisting criteria are, if they've changed at all. Yeah, and if the courses have changed in the way that they're run. I think Oxford underwent sort of an overhaul a few years ago in the directorship and in the way that the course was structured. So I guess applications to the course would then be judged differently based on the change in values and the ethos of the course. So I think it's always worth checking out the course's website just to check sort of what the course involves, if they've changed their training content, if they've changed their staff and that are doing the shortlisting, or what the shortlisting criteria are, that sort of thing. I don't know, but I guess, yeah, just check out the websites, I guess, of the courses that you want to apply to, and just assess what's changed, if anything has changed, or contact the courses and ask. I think a lot of them put on open days as well. And I guess in terms of the feeling discouraged to apply after rejections and other pressures, or missing a year, or applying, I think from my own experience, I think you should feel ready, I guess, in a sense, or certainly in terms of the application process, as Emily mentioned, I mean, sort of knowing somewhat of yourself and how you might react to the process, and whether you think that might be more damaging or might be okay, depending on how you might feel about it. But also, I mean, I asked myself a couple of years ago when I first started my master's, the consultant where I was working asked me if I was applying, and I think they were very much of the opinion that you should sort of have a go if you can. And I said I wasn't applying, and a few people definitely questioned that as to why I wasn't, and I said I just didn't feel like, first of all, I didn't feel like I could get through the application process without feeling really, really bad about it, because I didn't think I would get anywhere. But equally, I didn't really feel ready for training, because I hadn't finished my master's. There was still, I've just started, and it felt like there was so much to learn there that I was like, I don't really feel like I could do the doctorate at this point, because I just don't have the research skills. And that's why I did my master's. So I guess sort of have an honest conversation with yourself and ask yourself, are you ready? Are you ready to do the doctorate? And if you need, for whatever reason, to miss a year for any circumstances, whether that's personal circumstances, whether there's anything going on peripherally that you need to consider, yeah, I wouldn't say if you miss out a year that you're at a disadvantage, because as Emily said, you know, you've still got all of that time to, you know, maybe change a job, like if you change your job, or if you ask for some more responsibilities, or you do some volunteering, or, you know, if there's other things that are going on in your life that you can then sort of reflect on. You know, we're always sort of on a journey, I guess, and there's always something you can take from your experiences. So I wouldn't say that you would be at a disadvantage for missing a year at all.
Right. Just conscious we've got about 6 minutes left, so I think we've got enough time for one or two more questions. I just wanted to quickly add my kind of view for someone who hasn't gotten onto the DCLIN and has tried 3 times, I think it is. Emily, you wouldn't, yeah, it was the same year the group was made. So I think very much first year I was very much that kind of very typical person, always on the forums, very much involved in everything, always checking, you know, always anxious, and absolutely got nowhere, was crushed. Second year, did a lot better, managed to get 2 interviews and a reserve place, second reserve, with an offer from Edinburgh, and didn't get on ultimately, but, you know, handled it a lot better. And the most recent intake, got another interview with Edinburgh, but again, didn't make it at all. And for me, it was a case of, I very much came to that point that Emily had mentioned, which is I stopped letting the DCLIN define who I am and tried to get on with my life. I'm very fortunate that I'm currently on the CBT training with King's, and that CBT is something I'm really passionate about. I really enjoy doing therapy, and it's only a year long, and the process was only a month long as opposed to several months. So that did a lot of great for my mental health. And I'm at a point where actually I'm not going to be applying this year. And just that is just because I really want to focus on what I'm doing now and maybe come at it again in the future. And I think that's just a very personal thing. So you just really have to ask yourself whether, you know, now is a good time, because I don't think it's possible to apply and completely switch off from the process. It is going to take some of your mental capacity, especially once those applications, people start hearing from those applications. So I think for me, because I'm going to be doing quite a difficult course, I really don't want my focus to switch halfway as well. But yeah, so that's just kind of my view for someone who hasn't been successful. So we've got a question and one more question in the chat, and then I've got one question that I've asked everyone in the webinars up until now. So we've got, I think this is just following on the other question earlier, is that right, Sophia? So I have 12 years experience as a counsellor, and clinical is different in emphasis on diagnosis of personality disorders. Would it be okay to emphasise person-centred values? Sorry, I know it's a difficult question to answer. And then I think there was a follow-up. I do think it fits with the ethos of my first choice, but maybe not all. Yeah. So is that more clear, guys?
Yeah.
Great. Bianca?
Yeah, definitely. Go for it. I mean, I guess it depends on different courses, but UEL definitely has more of a person-centered approach, and I mean, I've only had like 3 weeks of teaching, but they've definitely, we talked a lot about diagnoses and why they're problematic and so on. So it definitely sounds like you would be a good fit for them. But I think in general, you know, always I would personally make sure that my values shine in my application, because you want to make sure that you're a good fit for the course. And yeah, I think there's definitely loads of courses that maybe are considered more that lean towards a sort of constructionist view of things, that would definitely agree with you. So yeah, I would go for it.
Great. Emily?
I think similar to what Bianca said, I can only obviously speak for Leicester, but Leicester are also, I'd say, on the whole, quite critical of diagnoses, and that comes out a lot in teaching. And I just think, yeah, like, I think your values are obviously like who you are, and I think if you had to kind of not hide them, but maybe, I don't know, not kind of stay true to them or not be completely honest about them because you thought a course might not like it, I would say maybe that course is just not a good fit for you. And actually, I think, and I someone said this to me before, and I really think it's important, because the process is so difficult that it can be very tempting to try and give courses exactly what you think they want and kind of the ideal candidate, but actually it's just as important that you pick the right course as well, and you have a choice as well, and you have to like what they are going to offer you, and it's a two-way process, and it can feel very difficult to hold on to that sometimes, but actually if their values don't fit with you, then you can actually have some control over that as well, and say, actually I don't choose you, almost, if that makes sense. So I think picking a course that actually works for you and suits your values and who you are is just as important as what courses want to pick you. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does.
Yeah. And Jade?
That's I mean, I can only speak for Oxford in terms of their values, and certainly I've only been there for like 2 weeks, so I'm not totally sure on much at the moment, to be honest, in terms of what they're I mean, I get the impression certainly that, I mean, the course at Oxford is very person-centered. We have had brief chats about diagnosis at the moment, and we've had a lot of chats about admin and skills training so far, so we haven't had much conversation about clinical issues just now, but it's definitely quite person-centered, and we emphasize sort of the humanistic values, certainly in terms of the therapeutic alliance, and in all of our skills training, we're very much emphasizing the humanity of the conversation rather than any sort of protocol driven exercises. But I would agree with Emily and Bianca in that when you're choosing your courses, just think about what the ethos of the courses that you are choosing are, and if they fit with you. And I like what Emily said about sort of, if you find a course that you actually think no, then it's okay to say no to them, rather than thinking you have to apply, obviously because the process is so competitive and you want to maximize your chances. But yeah, thinking about the courses, ethoses, and what they're offering in terms of their content and their training. Different courses offer different streams of training as well. So at Oxford, for example, offer the systemic stream and also a neuropsychology stream. So if you're interested in those things, then obviously that would be something to look into. So yeah, just I guess look at the courses and what they're offering. Yeah.
Oh, so they do what? Systemic and what?
They do a neuropsychology
Thank
stream.
you. I've got there's a spreadsheet I put which is in the chat, and that was the one I was missing for Oxford.
Yeah.
In terms of models. Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to say as well, it is really important to make sure you pick the right course that fits for you, because you're going to spend 3 years with them. So you want to make sure that it's in line with your values. And I think if you do try and hide your values, I think that's just going to come across in your application and interview, that you're not being true to yourself, and they'll see through that as well. I can see there's other questions, though we are running out of time. See if we can answer these ones quickly. Okay, so it's not, yeah, no, of course there is. I think there's definitely going to be difficulties. People are going to have different difficulties based on their own personal circumstances as well. Thank you. Great. So I guess my final question then for you guys, and I've asked this for every webinar. The main question in the application is asking you to reflect on your experiences that make you feel ready to apply for the doctorate. And I think that word reflection is a word that's thrown a lot in psychology as well, but it might not be something that everyone can necessarily do or understand from the bat. It can be a skill, and I think people do reflect generally, but knowing how to reflect, especially in writing, can be more of a skill. So what would be your advice to people in terms of maximizing their chance of reflecting the best they can on that application? So are you think anything you find helpful, any models you would recommend people looking at? Bianca?
Well, yeah, it's easier said than done. I think what helped me when I was writing my application is I asked my supervisor to read it, and the advice that she gave me is that at the end of every sentence or paragraph, ask yourself, and so what? And that is just kind of a way to keep digging into that thought that you had or that experience. So I just kept asking, and so, but what does that mean? And so, but why? And but why is this even relevant to write here? And so I just kind of kept questioning what I was writing, and then tried to distill it, because obviously you don't have that many characters, to, I guess, the reflection that I wanted to communicate. So yeah, I guess ask yourself, so what, many times. Hopefully you'll get somewhere.
And so it sounds like a little bit of using the Driscoll model of reflection there, that kind of what, now what, so what kind of approach. Yeah. So if anyone is interested in maybe looking at that Driscoll, but anything else before we pass over to Emily?
No, I mean, it's very difficult. I think reflection is very difficult, but then trying to explain how you reflect, I think, is even harder.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, it is difficult. And I think earlier on, that kind of the whole concept of reflecting like really kind of overwhelmed me, and I was like, people keep talking about this, and that if you ask anyone for advice on like what you should do, they just keep telling you to reflect, and how do you actually do that? What does it actually mean? And I think I found that I started to get feedback through like supervision and things that I was a very reflective person before I actually realized that I was reflecting. And that probably sounds silly, but that is kind of just how it seemed to go for me. And I think from my own experience, I guess it just, when you've worked with someone, or even just when you've kind of had supervision, or you've had a conversation with a colleague that's like gone a certain way, I think just like kind of noticing how you feel like during it and also after it, if you're kind of left frustrated or annoyed or positive and like kind of feelings as well, just kind of exploring that a little bit and like going with that and wondering why that is, and maybe like what was it about that interaction, whether that was with a client or with a colleague, that made you feel the way it did, and what does that say about you. And I think also something that I found really helpful, more so since I starting training through my kind of experiences of supervision, is just like really starting to reflect more on my own experiences outside of kind of training and work, and like why maybe like how the relationships I have with like family and where I fit within my sort of family system, how they might affect the work that I do, and how I don't know, if I was working with a family, like I've just had a year-long trial placement, like why I might relate more to one person in the family, and how I can make sure that I'm aware of that, so that I don't allow that to impact how I work in sessions, if that makes sense. I don't know if that helped at all, but that's just what I do.
And Jade?
With reflection, I mean, I echo again that it's such a funny concept, because everybody, we all talk about it, but what does it mean and how do you do it? And it seems to be something that I certainly thought at the beginning, is it just something that you acquire? Like, do some people have it, some people don't? How do you get it? So certainly something that I think is worth bearing in mind is that again linking to what Emily was saying, is that as people, we're not necessarily islands separate from each other. And as a psychologist, when you're going into working with a team or working with a client, or like in a managerial role, in a leadership role, you need to be aware of what we're bringing to that situation. And that, I think that's a good starting point, as to sort of thinking about what sort of affects you as a practitioner. How do you interpret situations? What do you focus on? What are you less comfortable with? What are you more comfortable with? Some models that I found really helpful are Kolb's learning cycle. I found that definitely, certainly when I first started thinking about reflection, it's quite a helpful prompt. It sort of has lots of questions. Some of the diagrams that I've seen just from a Google, so I remember Googling it, and there are just questions within each part of the cycle that you can use as a prompt to help you think, okay, think through a particular situation in particular. And another model that I found very helpful is I don't know if it's a model or I don't really know. The social graces, Burnham's social graces, are very helpful in thinking about who you are and what you bring to a situation. I remember having a client once that I found really affected me, and I found it very hard to work with them because I felt so personally similar to the person that it was very hard for me to work with them. And something my supervisor asked me to do was use the social graces to think about how we're similar, but think about how we're different. So I think that's a really good example of how you can use a model to sort of help you get a bit of distance from what you're doing. And I think ultimately that's, now when I think about reflection, that's what I think of reflection is it's being able to step back from a situation and observe it almost as a bird's eye view and think about what's going on. And as you get more experience doing that, I think you start to be able to do that in situations. So when you're in a situation, I don't know, that might frustrate you or might make you feel a certain emotion, you can almost observe yourself in that moment. I remember being incredibly irritated by working with a particular member of staff just because we have very different views on certain things. And initially I would dread having meetings with this person, but over time I managed to see the position they were in and the position I was in, and maybe that told me something about our dynamic. And from that I was able to sort of go in with a different mindset and almost reflect in the process, like in the meetings, and think, instead of getting really angry internally, because I used to boil in these meetings, I would be able to think, okay, that's making me really annoyed. Why is it making me annoyed? And that, I think over time you start to be able to develop sort of reflective skills in the moment as well as afterwards. But it's definitely just sort of an ongoing process, and it's something that I don't think you ever really master. It's just because you're always, something that supervision is great for is to prompt you and to help you think about situations. And there's always something you can learn. So yeah, I think finally, I'm just very quickly mentioning, if you struggle with reflection or if you want to practice, I think journaling is a really great way of doing it. And you can use all the models, and I used to take parts of my journal, not necessarily to supervision, but I used to take sort of excerpts that I thought were really pertinent, and that helped, if that makes sense. If that's helpful.
Thank you. And actually yesterday, something that was mentioned, and I'd never thought to mention it before, is the difference between reflection and reflexivity. And I think reflexivity is something we often can ignore, and I think it's something everyone would have done at some point in their practice, particularly if you are a counsellor. I can imagine using this quite regularly. But just to kind of explain for those who aren't quite aware, when we think about reflection, we kind of think of it as thinking about something after the event, whereas reflexivity, by contrast, might be a more immediate and dynamic self-awareness, and in that very moment, maybe adjusting, changing what you're doing in the event as it's happening. Whereas reflection was very much, oh, it's happened, this is how it's affected me, this is what I've learned, this is what I might be doing different next time, or this is what's worked well as well. And so I think it's quite important and useful to be aware of those differences. And it might be useful, again, the three panelists might know better than me, but to kind of maybe demonstrate that reflection, but also maybe talk about how that reflection has then applied more into that reflexivity. in practice to kind of demonstrate. Clinical psychology is all about evidence-based practice. So what better way to actually say, yeah, I've reflected, and this is actually how I changed my practice as well.
Sorry, Jason. I was just thinking, just quickly adding to, I guess, what you've said, and just generally, something that I found helpful was a supervisor pointed out to me, and I think it was only like, I think it was since training that, and I think it is a good starting point, because I think a lot of people will probably feel the same, because I think our kind of profession attracts perfectionists, and so I think my supervisor kind of pointed out, like, we were talking about perfectionism and she'd kind of recognized it in me and we were talking about it, and it was really helpful for me to think about, because actually it's something that I think last year I was working with someone who was a perfectionist, and I was like missing that, because I was missing that they were holding themselves to very high and unrealistic standards, because I do the same thing. And so now, like, kind of using supervision in that way and recognizing I was doing that was really helpful for me in working with that person. But now I'm also able to like apply that more and think earlier on, before it's pointed out to me, oh, am I not recognizing that this person is actually also kind of being very hard on themselves, or kind of really being unrealistic in what they're expecting of themselves. And I think it's just maybe a good starting point, because I do think our profession does attract perfectionists, so lots of people hopefully can relate to that.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really great example of the two as well. So I think that kind of reaches the end. We are a little overboard, but tends to happen when we get engaged in great conversation. Before we go, I would like to put everyone on the spot and just say final words from the panelists. Any final words? Jade, go in a different order.
Oh.
You thought you had a bit of time.
I'm definitely on the spot now. Gosh, final words. I think, I mean, certainly I know some people have left. I think good luck, and I hope that you found some of the stuff that we've talked about today helpful. And I think, yeah, I think a theme that's definitely come out of the webinar today is to sort of maybe, what's the word? Lost my words. Classic. To be yourself as much as you can in your application, and really demonstrate who you are as a person, what your values are, what you're hoping to gain from training, and yeah, I guess who you are and what you're bringing. I think that's the most important. When people ask me what like the most important thing is, I guess that is, even though it is cheesy, yes, just to be yourself and demonstrate you're a real person behind your application. Yeah, and look after yourselves, even though it's really hard to do. But I hope today we've helped give you some ideas to help with that.
Right, thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I think I echo that. I echo what Jade said, really. And I think just trying to hold on to the fact that even when it feels like maybe you aren't, because of the horrible process that clinical psychology entails, you are good enough. And actually, if you care about other people and about their well-being, and you want to make a difference, and you're human, and you can kind of have a conversation with someone where you're kind of empathic and I guess conscientious and caring, like, you're halfway there, really. And I know that probably sounds really silly and cliche, but actually, like, that's the most important thing. And you can learn all of the rest, and the course will teach you all of the rest. You don't need to know everything, and you are good enough. So sorry for being cringy, but they're my parting words. And good luck.
I think compassionate talk is never cringy. It's always needed, especially for candidates applying for the DCLIN. Bianca?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Jade and Emily said, and take it easy. It's just a job. Don't forget that. And you might get on one day and maybe you won't, but it doesn't make you less of a good enough person to work in this field. You can still work in mental health or in psychology in a different capacity, and that's okay. Yeah, it's not you know, clinical psychology is in the gold standard, definitely. So take care of yourself and good luck.
Thank you. And then just my parting words. Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks for everyone, the panelists who made this really easy. When I set this whole thing up, I wasn't expecting anyone to respond. And in total, I've been amazed having 12 people contribute to the webinars and having over 30 people contribute to looking over applications for people, which I think is just amazing. And bearing in mind, those 30 people are looking at multiple applications. So all in all, that's like 100 applications, which is incredible. And I just want to say that I think as long as you can answer the question, why do I want to be a clinical psychologist? I think that's the way to lead on from, because just being your genuine self. I think the clinical doctorate in the recent years is really leaning on towards a new generation of thinking and practicing in clinical psychology. And I think more than ever, we need people who are just really true to themselves and humanistic in their approach. But thank you all for coming. This has been recorded and I will put the link up once it's been uploaded. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.